What happens when an ordinary fuel engineer decides to challenge the Air Force command? His idea was ridiculed, banned, and deleted from reports. But what happened next forced the generals to rewrite history. You want to know when I realized brains don't mean a damn thing in a uniformed town? October 1941. Long Beach, California. Sun cooking the concrete like it held a personal grudge. The whole Douglas aircraft plant grinding day and night like it was going to chew up Hitler itself. You could hear rivets popping 3 blocks out. Smelled like oil, sweat, and whatever was burning in the break room toaster. I was 28, chemical engineer, MIT degree. Not that it helped much around here. Civvy badge clipped to my collar, grease under my nails, skin 2 shades too dark for most folks to listen past good morning. Name's Steve Randolph, if anyone's still asking. But that day, I wasn't trying to start no war. I was trying to fix one. See, I'd been working this fuel blend in my off hours. Mix of modified octanes, fine-tuned vapor pressure, less knock, lower burn temp, more stability under climb stress. Real boring stuff to most folks, unless you happen to fly one of those B-17s and like coming home with your skin intact. I called it a smart burn mix. Nothing fancy. Didn't cost more than a few tweaks in the plant process. But what it did do? Gave those engines more throttle without blowing their guts across the tarmac. It ran cooler, cleaner, and faster. I had numbers to back it. I had test burns. Hell, I had proof. All I needed was someone up the ladder to take 5 damn minutes and care. That was my first mistake. The guy I reported to, Captain Halley, was a paperweight with shoulders. Desk man. Believed in 2 things, protocol and coffee you could use to strip paint. His office had a fan that never worked and a wall covered in memos he never read. I stepped in with the sample folder in my hand, a little nervous maybe, but mostly proud. Not cocky, just sure. Sure that if the war was real, the people running it would want something that worked better. "Captain," I said, laying the file down, "I got something you're gonna want to see. New burn mix, better engine temp, better push, no major cost increase." He didn't even look up, sipped his coffee, stared out the window like someone had promised him a better view. "You run it past procurement?" "No, sir. It's not a request. It's a field-tested improvement. I've got engine logs." "You know how long it took Washington to approve the current mix, Randolph?" he asked, finally setting his cup down. 4 months. You think we're gonna upend that just because some bright boy got clever with his chemistry set? I blinked, thought maybe he misheard me. "I'm not asking to change contracts," I said carefully, "just to test it officially. We've already done preliminary runs, engines holding temp 9 degrees lower at climb. That's real margin, real results. This isn't a theory. That'll be all," he cut in, picked his coffee back up. "And that was it. No thank you. No maybe. Just shut the door on your way out, boy." I walked out of there carrying the same folder I walked in with. Only now it felt heavier, like it knew. Back in the lab, my technician, Harry Sanders, was elbow-deep in a stripped-down engine. Big guy, Arkansas drawl. Didn't care who you prayed to as long as your math held up. He looked up, saw my face, and didn't even need to ask. "They laugh it off," he muttered, wiping his hands. "They didn't even read it." We stood there for a second. 2 grown men in a hangar full of roaring machines and blank stares. Then he reached over, grabbed the folder from me and flipped it open. "Screw 'em. We'll log it ourselves." And we did. We kept running tests. Nights, weekends, lunch breaks. Engine 217B became our baby. Ran it with my blend, logged every rev, every hiccup, every degree of temperature change. We built a case so solid you could fly a damn bomber through it. But every time we submitted it up the chain, dead. Silence. Or worse, resubmit through appropriate channels. One day we came in and found our data rack locked. Someone had flagged our fuel work as unauthorized R&D. I went to the supervisor's office, not to beg, but to ask. Calm, direct. You got pilots flying with fire under their feet, and we've got a solution. What the hell's the problem? He looked at me like I'd asked to borrow his wife. The problem, Randolph, he said with a half-smile, is you're acting like this is a democracy. Now let me tell you something about American factories during wartime. They ran on coffee, fear, and quiet obedience. You speak up too loud, they find a way to move you somewhere quieter. 2 days later, I got reassigned to a logistics desk in an annex building across the airfield. No lab, no access, no engines. Message received. I sat at that desk staring at shipping invoices like they were written in Morse. All the while, guys like Hallie sat cozy, guarding the old ways like they were scripture. Because God forbid someone like me, young, black, not a lieutenant, had the gall to improve something. But let me tell you something else. You can reroute a man. You can demote him, ignore him, lock his tools, burn his notes. But you can't unteach what he knows. You can't unprove what works. And deep down, they knew it. What happened next changed everything. You don't want to miss how this story unfolds. When push came to shove, and the system pushed too hard. You ever been moved out of your own work like a piece of furniture? Not fired. Not even told you're wrong. Just relocated. Quietly. Politely. Like someone nudging your chair a few inches to the left, out of the way of real business. That's how they did it to me. They called it a temporary reassignment, sent by internal memo with my name typed in bold, but no signature at the bottom. I was to report to Annex 3B Logistics Unit, effective immediately. That's how it always starts. Not with shouting or some dramatic scene, but with paper. Thin, white paper with thick gray meaning. Annex 3B was a former storage bay at the edge of the airfield, past the fuel tanks and the fence, where the paint peeled off in sun-warped flakes. The building smelled like old boxes and forgotten promises. My desk was a dented metal table with a wobbly chair, a rotary phone with no dial tone, and a window that looked out on a wall. Welcome to the sidelines. Nobody said it out loud, but the message was clear. Stay in your lane. Stop making noise. You got too many ideas for someone with no stripes on their shoulder. And I'll be honest with you, it got to me. You pour yourself into something. You give up weekends, lunches, sleep. You eat cold sandwiches next to hot engines. You risk looking foolish, arrogant, even wrong, because you believe it's worth it. And then, one day you blink, and you're sitting in a dead-end room with a stack of invoices and a stapler that barely works. For a while, I did the job. Quietly. Shifted parts requests, tracked engine shipments, pushed paper across tables like it might matter. And every time I passed the flight line, watching those 4 engine birds thunder into the sky with the wrong fuel mix boiling their bellies, I bit my tongue so hard it nearly bled. Some nights I'd sit in that windowless room, turning over my notes by dim desk light, wondering if maybe they were right. Maybe I had overstepped. Maybe I should have waited, filed the proper forms, played the game. Maybe they just didn't want some engineer with no rank and the wrong last name telling them how to fly their war. But here's the thing about truth. It doesn't vanish just because someone locks the door. It sits there, waits, smolders, and then, one day, it finds a crack. That crack came in the form of a new face. Her name was Alice Monroe. Civilian contractor, mid-30s, came from an oil firm back east and had just been assigned to the fuel logistics department. Smart, fast-talking, sharp as broken glass. She'd read my file before she even met me. I knew that because the first thing she said, standing in my doorway, arms crossed, was, "You the one who built the unauthorized blend?" I looked up from my paperwork. "Depends who's asking. I'm not here to report you, Steve. I'm here because your numbers made my coffee go cold." She walked in, dropped a folder on my desk and pointed. "Your formulation's tighter than what Shell's shipping. You cut flash temp by how much?" 7 degrees a climb, 9 in steady cruise." She whistled, "And they buried it." "They didn't bury it," I said, voice flat. "They just pretended it never existed." Alice sat down like she owned the chair and tapped her fingers against her knee. "I came here thinking I'd have to fix some paperwork mess. Instead, I find a working solution they locked in a drawer. For the first time in weeks, I felt like the air in the room had color again, not just gray." "What do you want from me?" I asked. She leaned forward. "I want to know if you're still in." That question hit hard, because the truth was, I didn't know. I'd taken the hits, the silence, the sideline desk, and I'd swallowed it, deep. But there was something about the way she asked it, like she wasn't here to babysit or to save me. She was offering a hand, sure, but not a rope. If I got back in, it'd be on my own 2 feet. I nodded, and we got to work. We didn't go through command. Not again. Not yet. We went sideways. Alice had access to sample pipelines, fuel shipment reports, engine performance logs. She helped cross-reference my data with field incidents, early engine failures, overheating reports, fuel pump degradation. She was the numbers woman. I was the hands. Together we built the case again, brick by brick. Every test we did, off record, confirmed the same thing. My blend ran cleaner, not just better, safer. We were talking fewer engine fires, more climb power, reduced maintenance. If the Army had actually looked, they'd have seen it, but they weren't looking. They were defending. The wall we were up against wasn't just bureaucracy. It was ego. The men at the top hadn't rejected my idea because it was wrong. They rejected it because it wasn't theirs. So we found someone else. His name was Lieutenant Daniel Avery. Young, gutsy, newly assigned to a B-17 test crew with more curiosity than caution. He'd heard about my mix through back-channel whispers, mechanics talk, off-duty chatter, the kind of stories that float between hangars after the brass goes home. He came to me one evening, still in flight suit, sweat on his collar and grease on his boots. "You the fuel guy?" he asked. "I used to be. I hear you've got something that runs cooler on climb." I raised an eyebrow. "That depends who's flying." He grinned. "My crew's got a test window next Thursday. We're scheduled to run simulated payload climbs. If I got a sealed barrel of your mix on board, could you make sure it gets to the tarmac?" I didn't answer. I just stood up, opened the cabinet behind my desk, and slid a single tin out onto the table. "You didn't get this from me." He nodded. "And if it flies, then maybe someone finally stops pretending it doesn't matter." That barrel made it onto the runway. The engine logs from that flight, marked as normal test procedures. But between the lines we saw it. Engine temps stayed low. Fuel burn was steady. Climb rate improved. The crew even cut a few seconds off expected time to altitude. Not enough to trigger suspicion, but just enough to confirm what we already knew. Problem was, word travels. Someone from procurement flagged the fuel barrel as inconsistent with requisition specs. They ran the chain backward, sniffing for leaks. Alice got a warning. I got called into a meeting with a man in a suit who wouldn't give his name. "You're playing with protocol, Randolph," he said. I looked him in the eye. "I'm playing with fire, sir. The current mix is garbage, and people are getting hurt because no one wants to admit they can't read a spreadsheet." He didn't smile, didn't blink, just stood up and said, "This is your last caution," and walked out. Now you might think that would stop us, but you'd be wrong, because by that point, it wasn't just me or Alice or one test pilot with a wild streak. There were engineers, mechanics, flight crew, people who saw it, people who knew. And when people know something's right, not by politics, not by chain of command, but by truth, you can't lock that up in a drawer. You can try, but paper walls tear, and doors don't stay closed forever. This was only the beginning. The next chapter, everything breaks wide open. Stick around. You won't believe what comes next. If stories like this one, about people whose ideas were rejected but who changed the course of history, captivate you as much as they do us, subscribe to our channel. We have many more forgotten but truly powerful episodes from World War II ahead of us. And in the comments tell us, what would you do in the hero's place if your idea saves lives but no one listens to you? They say change moves slow in war. But sometimes it ain't change that moves slow. It's the people in charge of stopping it. By the time that test barrel of mine rolled across the tarmac under Lieutenant Avery's bomber, something had shifted. Not at the top. No, those chairs were still warm with the same old backsides, but underneath, in the hangars, in the break rooms, in the shadows where real work gets done. Mechanics were whispering, pilots were asking quiet questions. Fuel crew were checking logs and pretending not to nod when numbers lined up too neatly to ignore. And that scared them. You could smell it. Not fear in the open. Fear never wears a name tag in the military. No, this fear came in forms like routine audits or urgent reassignments or closed-door meetings with men who never wore a badge or a nameplate. But fear's still fear, no matter how it dresses. They called a surprise inspection that Monday. Full sweep. Every department, every lab, every sample logged and accounted for. I wasn't shocked. Alice wasn't either. We just braced. We knew what they were looking for. Not danger, not sabotage, just proof that we were right. They didn't find the blend. We had burned the last of it. What they did find, though, was Alice's test logs, encrypted and coded, but still traceable. They found engine performance printouts that didn't match any filed official fuel compositions, and they found copies of my early formulations, tucked in a folder behind false inventory sheets. Let me be clear, they wanted to make it a criminal matter. They wanted to say unauthorized material handling, endangering flight safety, bypassing procedure. They were building something ugly, but here's what happened instead. They brought in a tribunal. Not a court-martial, I was civilian, but a review board, which is just a fancy name for a firing squad with clipboards. 3 officers, 2 contractors, and 1 consultant from D.C. I sat across the table in a wrinkled white shirt. No lawyer, no rank, Just me, my notes, and the truth that hadn't stopped burning since they first pushed me out. One of the officers, Colonel Reeves, a man who'd made a career out of saying no with a smile, opened the folder and tapped the first page like he was holding a confession. "You created this formulation without clearance, is that correct?" "I created it because the current one was failing. Is that correct?" He blinked once. Didn't answer. Another panelist, civilian, leaned forward. "Do you understand that unofficial testing, even if well-intentioned, can cause real consequences?" "You mean like engines catching fire mid-climb?" I said. "That kind of consequence?" The room got quiet. I laid it all out, not with attitude, not with apologies. Just the facts, just the numbers, field data, test logs, comparative analysis. I'd brought a box with me, filled with everything we'd done. I opened it and placed it on the table. "I didn't come here to break rules," I said. "I came here to keep people from dying because someone didn't want to look twice at a better option." Colonel Reeves closed the folder. "This isn't about the numbers, Mr. Randolph. This is about chain of command." And there it was. Not safety, not truth, not innovation, control. Alice was next. They tried to intimidate her, corner her, trip her up with technicalities, but Alice was steel wrapped in lipstick. She tore through their questions with data and calm. Every answer she gave drove one more nail in the coffin of their defense. When they adjourned for the day, we sat outside on the concrete steps. The air was hot but dry. My shirt stuck to my back. "You think they'll listen?" I asked. She didn't answer right away. "I think they're hoping we give up before they have to admit they were wrong." 2 days later, I was relieved of duties pending final decision. No access to the plant, no lab, no pass. Alice, same deal. We were out. But that's not where the story ends, because the one thing they didn't plan for, the one variable they never considered, was how many people were watching. Quietly, closely, people who knew something wasn't adding up. That weekend I got a knock at my door, Lieutenant Avery. He wasn't smiling. "They're grounding my crew." "Why?" "No reason given, but I think you and I both know why." He reached into his bag and pulled out a sealed envelope. Inside were performance evaluations, pilot notes, and, most importantly, a copy of the after-action report from that test flight. It was glowing. "They said I wasn't authorized to request your blend," he said, "but they never said I couldn't document what it did." He looked me dead in the eye. "You still got the formula?" That moment, that was it. No speeches, no fanfare. Just a man with dirt on his boots and fire in his gut asking me a simple question. And I gave him a simple answer. We set up off-site. An old garage on the edge of town, belonged to a friend of Alice's, a mechanic with more tools than questions. We brought in small-scale equipment, rigged a basic lab, and started refining again. This time we didn't aim for tests. We aimed for undeniable, every batch, every variation, every improvement. Logged, cross-referenced, tested on civilian engines. We got pilots from the reserve, mechanics on leave, even a few instructors from the local training base who were sick of watching rookies go up in smoke. It grew, quietly, and with every engine that ran cleaner, every logbook that didn't overheat, every crew that came back saying what was that mix, the weight shifted. They couldn't ignore it forever. But we weren't waiting for them to catch up. We were already ahead. This chapter was the break. What comes next? The fallout. And trust me, it's nothing short of explosive. There's a certain silence that comes after you've done all you can. Not peace. Don't mistake it. Peace is earned. What I'm talking about is the tight, loaded quiet that settles in when you realize the people in charge ain't changing, and now it's on you to move the damn line. We were there. The garage was humming every night like a second shift in a city that never wanted to admit it needed one. Not official, not legal, but real. We had burners, we had barrels, we had data sheets tacked to plywood like blueprints for something better. The only thing we didn't have? Permission. But see, permission is for people who can afford to wait. The next push came from a man we never expected. Chief Master Mechanic Ron Bell. 40 years in prop maintenance. Crew cut so tight you could see daylight between the strands. White jumpsuit, clipboard in hand, and an expression that made rookies sweat through their undershirts. He'd never so much as glanced in my direction back at Douglas. Not because he hated me, but because men like Bell didn't have time for the science guys. Until he showed up outside the garage at 6:30 a.m. sharp with a thermos of coffee and a single sentence. My nephew almost burned up on climb-out last week. I heard you got a better way. That's all he said, and that was enough. We didn't sit around talking after that. There wasn't time. The war was roaring, and if the suits wouldn't make room for change, we'd squeeze it in between the cracks. Bell brought in 3 more mechanics. Men who knew every inch of those bomber engines better than their own beds. They didn't need convincing. They needed fuel. Alice managed the logistics. She got her hands on raw components through friendly suppliers who didn't ask too many questions. We were running close to the edge, but it wasn't reckless. It was precise. Every blend batch was logged. Every run was tracked. No guesses. No shortcuts. We were professionals, even if the world kept trying to call us amateurs. And then came the call. It was a small base out in Nevada. Training field, low visibility in the press, even lower oversight. A flight instructor had heard about the blend from one of Bell's guys. Said they were cycling new pilots through engine stress tests and losing too many engines too early. He asked, off the record, if we could supply enough mix for 2 aircraft. No paperwork, just barrels, labeled as maintenance-grade cleaner. We said yes. I loaded the truck myself. We drove it through the desert like it was gold. They ran it the next morning, quietly, cleanly, without ceremony. The logs came back glowing, engines held cooler, response time sharpened. Fuel efficiency even ticked upward. Nothing flashy, just solid, hard-earned performance. The kind that gets you home. 2 weeks later, we got 3 more requests. No names, just numbers, just coordinates. The back door had opened. Now, here's where things got tight. When the numbers started flowing back in from these quiet tests, it was no longer just about fuel. It was about momentum. More and more people, engineers, maintenance officers, even a few pilots with pull, started coming around. Not publicly, not with flags, but you could feel the current shift. And when something starts moving that wasn't allowed to move, people notice. Which is why one morning I found 2 men standing outside my apartment. Not military, not police. Private suits, nice shoes, clipped tones. One carried a folder, the other, a question. Mr. Randolph, may we speak with you regarding your work on aviation fuel reformulations? I let them in, sat across from them with a pot of half-warm coffee and hands that didn't shake, but were ready if they had to. They weren't there to arrest me. They were there to offer me a position. High clearance, backed by a contractor. Said they were interested in alternative approaches to propulsion chemistry under wartime urgency. I asked what took them so long. They smiled, thin and professional. "You've made quite an impression, off the books." I didn't answer right away, because I knew what this was. It was a buyout, not of the fuel, of me. They wanted the formula, yes, but more than that, they wanted control. They wanted the narrative. To absorb the risk now that the results were undeniable and wrap it up in official packaging, with new names on the patents and a history that didn't include the people who bled for it in back rooms and garages. I closed the folder gently and slid it back. "I didn't build this for a title," I said, "and I didn't do it for men who only show up when it's safe. They didn't push. They didn't need to, because the pressure was already coming from somewhere else. Within a week, Alice got locked out of her contractor access codes. The garage was tagged by city ordinance for unauthorized chemical handling. One of Bell's mechanics got reassigned to Alaska, with 12 hours' notice. Quiet, clean retaliation. They couldn't stop the truth, but they could freeze the people trying to move it. I won't lie. It felt like the wall was back up, taller and colder than ever. Everything we'd built was being boxed up, erased, or rebranded. We were back in the shadows, but then something happened that nobody could scrub. A flight report leaked. Not officially, not in the press, but enough eyes saw it. Maintenance logs, engine metrics, climb profiles from a quiet test base in Arizona. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. The planes flying with the clean blend were outperforming the rest. Not by miracles, but by margins that mattered, margins that saved lives. The report made its way into the hands of a senior procurement advisor, a woman named Marion Holloway. She wasn't part of the old club. She didn't wear the same blinders. And when she saw the numbers, she asked one simple question at a quarterly review. Why aren't we using this blend system-wide? Nobody had a good answer. They shuffled. They deferred. They requested more data. But the seed was planted, and seeds, they don't ask permission to grow. That week, we got calls from 3 bases. One wanted full supply testing for an entire training squadron. Another asked for technical support in replicating the formula on site. The third, they didn't say much at all. They just sent coordinates and said, "Bring what you've got." This chapter was pressure. Next one, the flashpoint. Stay close, because when it breaks fast. It didn't come with a bang, no newspaper headline, no speech from some general behind a polished desk, no whistle-blowing hero standing in front of a microphone with tears in his eyes. No, it came with a fuel truck, a clipboard, and a single handwritten note. Run it. No report. That morning I stood on the edge of the airstrip at an air base that didn't officially acknowledge my presence. I wasn't wearing a uniform. No badge, no clearance, no welcome. Just me, a formula, and 2 barrels of a blend that had already saved engines, cut climb time, and pushed against everything the system swore it couldn't allow. I didn't speak. I watched. Because that was all I needed now, for them to see. The crew moved like they'd done this 100 times, probably had. A flight instructor barked orders with that clipped tone that only came from living too long under rules. But there was a different charge in the air. Not nervous, not proud. Focused. They loaded the barrels without a word, no questions, no delay. That B-17 on the tarmac, it had seen better days. Dull paint, dings in the fuselage. But it stood there like it still had fight left. And it did, because it was about to fly on our terms. And every pair of boots that walked up its ladder, every mechanic who checked its vitals, every pilot who tightened a strap, They weren't just flying a bird. They were flying resistance. The engines kicked over smoother than I'd ever heard. I'd listened to enough of those old radial roars to know when one had fight left and when one was faking it. These weren't faking. They rumbled like they wanted the sky. At 0610, the plane taxied. At 0614, it lifted. And at 0616, it disappeared into cloud cover like a clean secret. But that wasn't the moment that changed everything. That came 6 hours later. Back in the hangar, I was reviewing logs with Alice and Belle. Nothing official, of course, just red pen notes, stopwatch timings, oil residue analysis, the underground science of wartime truth. Then the call came in. It wasn't urgent, it wasn't loud, but it carried weight. Base Command requests presence of Randolph, Monroe, and Bell at South Briefing Room, 1600 hours. Now let me tell you something. When you're summoned to a room you've never been allowed in before, there are only two reasons. Either they're promoting you, or they're about to bury you. We went anyway. South Briefing Room wasn't marked. No signs, just a plain door with a security badge lock and a guard who didn't blink when he saw us. Inside, it was colder than it needed to be. Too many suits. Too much brass. Half a dozen people seated behind a long table, some with clipboards, others just watching. At the head, Colonel Reeves. He wasn't smiling. He waited until we sat. Didn't rush. Then he spoke, slow and clipped. We know about the tests. Alice didn't flinch. Bell crossed his arms. I stayed silent. Reeves opened a folder, probably thicker than most personnel files I'd ever had. Unofficial fuel handling, unauthorized distribution, testing outside regulation, collaboration with field crews without clearance, attempting to bypass formal procurement. He read it like a grocery list. Then he closed the folder. You know what this looks like from the outside? I met his stare. I know what it was on the inside. The room held still. He leaned forward, elbows on the table. That plane today ran your blend. It wasn't a question. I didn't answer, just nodded once. Reeves exhaled. Not with anger, with weight. It flew 5% faster to climb altitude, burned cooler, saved 83 gallons over scheduled flight profile. The report was signed by 2 flight instructors and 1 mechanical lead, all of whom backed the change. Still, no one moved. Headquarters is asking why this wasn't implemented sooner. You ever watch a wall crack? Not explode, not fall, just crack. With that first visible hairline, the one nobody wants to admit they see. That was this moment. Because the moment they ask why something good wasn't approved, they have to look at the ones who said no. And when they do, the whole structure shivers. That day, we weren't reprimanded. We weren't applauded either. We were absorbed. They gave it a new name. Blend X Aviation, Type 3. Stamped it, filed it, wrote us into a footnote of a memo we never saw. They reran the tests, this time on the record. It passed. By the end of the month, it was being rolled out in select squadrons as part of ongoing engine preservation research. Not a word about Randolph, or Monroe, or Bell. Not a word about the garages, the cold nights, the paper-thin logs, or the men who carried barrels in silence before dawn. But it didn't matter, because the blend was flying. And that was the win. A few weeks later, I got reassigned. Officially, this time. No surprise memos, no locked cabinets. I was offered a position on a team under the Office of Air Materiel Command. Still civilian, still buried in fuel ratios and combustion timing curves. But this time I had keys. Alice took a job at a research institute working on engine longevity models. Bell went back to his base. Quietly. No fuss. He said the engines ran smoother now. That was enough. And me? I still walk by that strip sometimes. Still watch those birds take off like they've got something to prove. They don't know me. They don't know what ran under their wings before it had a label. But I do. And that's all I ever needed. Because sometimes winning isn't being thanked. It's just knowing you are right. And that nobody can take that away from you now. The fight was never about glory. It was about getting the job done when nobody else would. And now that it is, the rest can argue over credit. We already had the truth. The war had many fronts. Europe, Pacific, Africa, skies, seas, sand, and steel. But there was another front, quieter, no medals, no parades. It ran through test hangars, paper trails, and chain-of-command blind spots. A war of ideas, buried under signatures and stamped denied before the ink was dry. And for those of us who fought it, victory didn't come with flags. It came with results. After the blend made it into use, something strange happened. The base didn't erupt in applause. Nobody stood on chairs and saluted. No phone call from Washington. No telegram from generals. It all got very quiet. Because when a system is forced to admit it was wrong, even silently, it doesn't celebrate. It just adjusts the story and moves on, hoping nobody asks questions. They assigned a new name to the blend, repackaged it in a standard military report, filed it under ongoing efficiency improvements, released a bulletin noting a slight enhancement in B-17 climb performance under revised fueling procedure. That was it. All that risk, all those nights, all those tests, wrapped in one sentence. But let me tell you something. When a bomber lifts faster than it should, when it climbs cooler than expected, when a mechanic looks at his gauge and smiles because the readings are too good to be true, that's our story. They don't have to say our names. The work says it for us. Still, the cost stayed with us. Bell didn't get promoted. He didn't want to be. He just kept the engines running. Alice turned down 2 consulting jobs. Big ones. She didn't want her work turned into a product pitch. She wanted to keep building, keep fixing things that mattered. Last I heard, she was working with post-war engine designers. Quiet, brilliant, unstoppable. Me. I stayed in the system. Not because I loved it, but because someone had to make sure the next Randolph didn't have to go through the same fight just to be heard. They gave me a lab, a real one, access, funding, a team that actually listened. And every now and then, someone would come through the door, tired, smart, frustrated, and I'd see that same fire I used to carry alone. I'd let them talk. I'd let them show me, and I'd say, let's test it, because if I learned anything from all this, it's that no piece of paper, no uniform, and no office ever invented progress. People did. The kind that don't wait to be told they're right. The kind that know it, and get to work anyway. Let me tell you about the last flight. Not combat, not training, a test. No headlines, just a quiet rollout of the final version of the blend, paired with a modified engine, one Alice helped tune herself. The pilot, a no-nonsense captain with more flight hours than conversation, volunteered to fly it himself. He took off at dawn. No brass, no speeches, just the hum of the propellers and a plane rising into air smoother than glass. He came back an hour later, climbed down the ladder, pulled off his helmet and looked at me. Didn't say a word, just held up one thumb. That was it. That was the ceremony, and it was enough. We filed the final logbook, stamped it, shelved it. Then we locked the lab for the night and walked out into that California dusk. Same airfield, same wind, same sun cutting across the hangars. But something had changed. Not out there, in here, because we knew. We'd won a war they didn't even know they were fighting. Years later, someone asked me during a guest lecture. One of those fresh-faced students with more curiosity than calluses. They asked, "Mr. Randolph, if they hadn't listened, would you still have done it?" I didn't even blink. "Son," I said, "they didn't listen. We did it anyway." And maybe that's what real change is. Not permission, not applause, just doing what needs to be done, and knowing deep down it mattered, even if nobody ever says your name.